A pastor and a priest walk into a movie theater. Hi, I'm Father Andrew Miller.
And I'm Reverend Michelle Byerly.
And this is A Pastor and a Priest Walk Into a Movie Theater, a podcast about faith, life, and the silver screen. Today we'll be discussing the 1994 drama film Corrina, Corrina.
For those of you who have not seen it, we encourage you to do so, as we will, of course, get into spoilers and conversations. And it is a powerful movie in its own right. It has Ray Liotta and Whopi Goldberg as its main leads, and is truly the story about a man's grief and his daughter's grief, this woman who enters their life, the relationship that they form, and the dynamics that come out of that. It is set in the 1950s, and so one of the topics that we'll get into is the topic of race. I think that's definitely a component of it as well. This is one that was selected by editor Wesley. So if Wesley wants to add in his own little comments about how he chose this movie, we can certainly do that. I can start with my own memories of this movie. It has been a long time since I had seen it until I watched. Mm-hmm.
Oh,
yeah. So when I was growing up, we watched it as a family, and I don't really remember all that much from it, except for the scene where she's blowing to get the stoplights to change color, and then towards the end when Molly is trying to do the same thing. So that's what I remember. But now going back and watching it later, there are a lot more layers that I picked up on with it, as you do, you know.
I have to say, the film did not do well with critics. It has, I think, a 39% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. And quite honestly, although I very thoroughly enjoyed the film, there are a number of things that I think you can critique about it. For one thing, it's a good companion film to The Help in all of the worst ways possible. And I can't stand The Help because it's I'm not sure I feel comfortable using the jargon term that we use for it, but it's the idea of bringing an old black lady in to save the day. White people just can't figure it out, and you need the jargon term is magic Negro, and it's a form of racism in its own right. It's a form of dehumanizing of African Americans because it demonstrates them as a kind of God forgive me, noble savage, and instead of with an ideal culture, instead of human beings with a complicated culture and complicated interpersonal relationships and that sort of thing. I think the film does that in a number of ways. You see the juxtaposition between the white rich people with whom Ray Liotta's character associates, and then of course Whoopi Goldberg's family. They're all nice and personable and friendly, and they saying this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. And it's like that's an oversimplification. So I thought it was dehumanizing in that regard.
Yeah. Well, and in that regard too, it sets it up as like almost this fairy tale relationship between these two, and yes, there is some element where both of their families are kind of saying, I don't know if this is going to work, but even that doesn't do enough to me to speak to the very serious realities. In that time period, it was still illegal to be a mixed race couple.
Yes.
Not until Loving versus the Virginia does that change nationwide. And so it doesn't deal with some of that reality. It is very much centered from the white perspective.
Yeah, and like The Help, which is I'm sorry, a terrible film. It's the whole point of the film is that you have the white savior who tells the story of black people, and you have the black the black woman who comes in to save the white people from their own stupidity and inability to get it together. And in both films, you really see that pattern. And as said, it's an oversimplification. It doesn't really talk about the fact that human beings, white, black, or other, are complicated. And there is no such thing as an ideal culture. And when we idealize the culture of persons of color, then we're being just as racist as when we claim ourselves to be superior.
Agreed. So we talk about this comparison to The Help, and I want to kind of clarify where we came from with that. And it comes from the fact that at the beginning of the movie, Ray Liotta's wife has died.
Mm.
We're not really sure what has caused that death. My suspicion would be illness, but there's not really an indication to say one way or another. And go ahead.
You could make it, well, I actually, and I've only seen the film once, so I may be forgetting a line that actually puts this theory to rest, but you could make a case that it was suicide. And the reason why I say that is because one of the lines that Molly has in that in the second stage of grief, which is anger, she's angry with her mother because she never said goodbye. Now that could mean any number of things. She could have gotten sick so quickly that she just never got the chance. She could have committed
or
suicide.
They wouldn't have let Molly see. Sometimes in that day and age, they tried to keep it from kids. And not really let them. She may not have been able to have that chance to say goodbye.
Yes.
So grief is definitely something that we'll talk about, but we start this movie where she has died, and now this is me going into the patriarchy just a little bit, because of course a man can't be expected to completely care for his daughter on his own, even as a working father. He needs someone to come in and help as a caregiver for Molly, the daughter, and as a housekeeper of sorts.
Yeah.
And so that's how we see all of these different horrible interviews, and one that actually gets hired, but very quickly gets fired.
Transference in the worst way possible.
And by the way, listener, transference is the idea that when we bring our own wounds and we treat someone else in the way that someone else has been that we would have treated someone else. Is that
well, it's so when a person falls in love with their therapist, that's an example of transference.
Yeah.
It's projecting your need from the perspective of the patient. Is projecting your need onto the therapist. The therapist helps you identify that you need something, and so you identify the therapist as the solution itself, and so you fall in love with the therapist, right? And you want to create more than a professional relationship. You want to create a personal relationship. And Joan Cusack's character in the movie, Corrina, who is I don't remember if they said that she had divorced her husband or if her husband had died, but wanted to be a wife. She wanted to be a wife and mother, and that's why she wanted the job to become the hired help to essentially, because she wanted essentially to become Ray Liotta's wife.
So it doesn't work out, and then we get this Corrina, who is very much set as a counterbalance, as a cool, hip, breaking the rules kind of way to that. Like, she doesn't act the same way.
I have to say, this is the second Whopi Goldberg film that we've watched, and it's the second Whopi Goldberg film in which she plays that very same character. She does a very good job playing that character.
Yeah, I had not thought about that, but you're right. And we come at a point where Molly is still not talking. She has. I would almost even go so far as to diagnose it as selective mutism. That's related to her grief. I don't think it's a permanent state, but it's definitely she's not really talking. And I want to back up just a little bit too. I love the bookends of the movie where one of the first scenes that we see in the movie is from Molly's perspective under the table, and she sees all of these shoes walking around. She hears these voices, and even, I would argue, gossip. The things that are being whispered around the situation. And so in the midst of Whoopi Goldberg's character coming, at first she doesn't speak.
She's mute for a good quarter of the film.
Yeah. And so I think about what a literal way of saying someone has lost their voice.
Which speaks, I think, to a theological, something theological, and that is we find ourselves in the eyes of the other. We don't exist as individual persons, except in the person of the other, and that's the Martin Buber I thou. In a very real sense, I think Molly's identity was caught up in her mother. And so by her mother's death, and this is true, I think, of anyone, this is why grief exists, when someone we love dies, a part of ourself dies, a part of our identity dies. And I think the loss of Molly's voice, the loss of the ability to speak, I think her ability to speak was bound up. Her voice, her identity, her expression of herself was bound up in the existence of her mother.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to say it. And so one of the first areas that becomes, I don't know if I say it's a critique, but it's definitely an area to look at in this film, is its theology around death and dying, because Ray Liotta's character is an atheist. He says he doesn't believe in heaven. He just basically believes that his wife is just gone. And so against that belief, then you have Whoopi Goldberg's character who comes in and says, no, that's not what I believe. I believe in a heaven. I believe in I'm trying to think of all of the language that she uses, but she expresses a different belief. And on some level, I appreciate that she meets Molly where she is, and she truly listens to her in a way that I don't think her father does. But I'm also a little not sure how I feel about her bringing in her beliefs.
Well, if I was a CPE supervisor, I might say it was a mixed bag. There's no doubt that it was helpful for Molly.
Yeah, the outcome was positive. I will not doubt that at all.
Yeah, and bumper sticker theology, which it was, she expressed bumper sticker theology. Your mother's in heaven. She's with the angels. You can take comfort in knowing that, and knowing that when we die, we go to heaven, and we get to be with our loved ones again, and all of that. That kind of bumper sticker theology that we find in evangelical circles. All right. Well, there's a reason why it's so popular, and partly because to some extent it does help. And honestly, well, there's great truth in it. I do believe in an afterlife, and I do believe that I'll see my grandpa again when I die, and I do take comfort in that. And it helped Molly to come to a sense of peace with the situation, to its credit. On the other hand, it wasn't really meeting Ray Liotta's character where he was at. Now, right. I was about to say, I stopped myself. I was about to say it wasn't really meeting Molly and Ray Liotta's character where they were at, but Molly isn't really anywhere. Like in that moment, Molly doesn't really know what to think. I mean, having not been raised in a church, and to my knowledge, atheistic parents, now if there are atheists among our listeners, please correct me, but to my knowledge, atheist parents as I encounter them, like, don't really have as much of a clear cut doctrine that they tend to like inculcate their children with. Whereas we Christians tell our children from the very beginning that no, when you die you go to heaven, you see your loved ones again, and you're with God for all eternity, and you're happy, right? Ray Liotta's an atheist. Corrina is not meeting Ray Liotta's character where he's at, but she's not really not meeting Molly where she's at, because Molly's nowhere. Molly isn't there. And don't hear that, please don't hear that as a critique of atheist parenting or a critique of it's just
she's just lost.
There's no position. She's not standing and running, right? And that's not a bad place to be necessarily. She's figuring herself out. It allows Corrina to come in and talk to her and meet her somewhere. In a certain sense, if she had a set doctrine like Ray Liotta's character, or even if she had a theistic doctrine, that would mean that there's less freedom in someone like Corrina coming in to approach her as a chaplain, as someone who is sitting with her in her grief. There's less freedom for that person to offer reframing of the situation. I mean, Corrina has to meet, if Corrina was a chaplain, Corrina has to meet Ray Liotta where he's at, because Ray Liotta's character has a doctrine. She has a lot more freedom and a lot more wiggle room with Molly, because Molly doesn't have a doctrine.
Yeah. Well, and you're absolutely right that Molly is trying to figure out who she is, because that's part of this whole thing too, is her growing up, her identity, because this will shape her. Mm-hmm. This is something that will shape her life. And I do say one of the major points of conflict at the climax is around Molly not going to school, because if I remember correctly, her peers are they're either teasing her about something, or something about school is very difficult for her. And the thing that I have an issue with the father about is he is not truly listening to Molly. Not from the words perspective, because she's not saying much, but she is saying volumes with her behavior. And from a I'm not a I didn't do as much in the child psychology realm as I did in just general psychology, but I will say Molly's behavior, if he were listening, speaks volumes.
And I think the film, to its credit, it does that intentionally. For instance, and you see this in a couple of ways. For instance, he doesn't understand why she keeps taking his cigarettes.
Yeah.
Even at the very, he never understands it. He never gets it. She doesn't. In one line, he tells her, "I'll buy you candy cigarettes." Right? He thinks she's trying to look cool like dad, when she is trying to keep him alive. She thinks cigarettes are going to kill him, so she steals them so that he doesn't smoke them and he doesn't die. One of my favorite parts of the film is when she offers cigarettes to her dad's would-be suitor, whom she doesn't like.
Yes.
But what's so interesting though is that the film gets, I think the film misses the mark in so many ways, but one thing that the film does get dead on is the social component of grief, and the fact that people around you, the generic you, want you to grieve in a certain way that is comfortable for them. Yeah. And that's why they set Ray Liotta's character up with that very, very shallow person who wants to come in, take control, make everything look all nice and pretty, and fix all the cracks in the vase that was accidentally smashed. And because confronting grief confronting the reality of loss and expressing the pain of that can make people around you uncomfortable. And that, to me, that's the meaning of the shoes, the scenes with the shoes where they're all talking about Molly and talking about what happened. And one line that really got to me was when some unnamed character said, well, she's too young to remember, so that's a blessing. Like, first off, she's not too young to remember. Second off, I'm not sure that it would be a blessing even if she was. So
yeah, and even if you're too young, in air quotes, your subconscious, your brain, it remembers. It knows. And your body knows. There's the book, somewhat controversial, or somewhat debated, that the body keeps the score. There's that element of, we know grief is an element of things. And yes, we as a culture are very uncomfortable with grief. And I think that's what makes Corrina so effective. Because when I think about all of the grief that she has experienced in her life in different ways, the hardships, the challenges, the struggles, she, for good or for ill, carries it with her. And she understands and she sees that grief in Molly.
Well, and her use of bumper sticker theology is not a distraction, to her credit. She does use it, and she allows it to be comforting for Molly. But on the other hand, there's also the scene where she says, "You're angry, and it's okay to be angry. Let's turn it into a game." In other words, she's in heaven waving down from you, and isn't that comforting? But there's also well, how do you feel about it? Confront the truth of how you feel about it and hit it dead on. And if you're angry, let's beat the crap out of something. It's not let's evade it. Let's and there's,
she sits in the grief.
Right. And it's like Corrina's way of dealing with grief in the film is contrasted. It's one of the parts of the film that I think is on mark, is contrasted with this idea that all the rich white people in the film need Ray Liotta's character and Molly to move on. They need them to move on, because they're not moving on makes it uncomfortable for them. Like they have to grieve in such a way that makes me comfortable. It makes the rich white people comfortable, and there is a sense in which I'm a firm believer, and this comes from my clinical pastoral education experience, that the most important thing we can do for our salvation in general is to confront the truth of, well, everything. The truth of who we are, the truth of how we feel, the truth of our relationships, the truth of where we are in this web of interpersonal relationships. And if I had a theology of grief, and I didn't study grief as in depth as you did, but if I had a theology of grief, it would be a theology that you have to confront grief. You have to confront the reality of what has happened and the reality of where you are with it. And that's hard. And it's going to make you uncomfortable. It's going to make other people uncomfortable, but it's the only way you can really come to terms with it and not move on, but turn grief from an enemy into a friend. It turned it in, and you were saying this in when we did the episode on the fountain, that grief is what reminds us that we have love. Grief becomes the companion
on the journey.
Right. It starts out as our enemy and then becomes our friend when we realize that it is the continuing presence of the person we've loved. It's the presence that reminds us that, well, in a certain sense, they're still there in the absence, and it's a good thing, and it never goes away, nor should it ever go away. Yeah. So
it simply becomes part of us. I mean, I think about, you were talking about the vase that was smashed and trying to hide the cracks. Of course, I think we've talked about it here before, the art, the Japanese art of putting things back together, but highlighting the broken places, highlighting the cracks. So, we started to touch on it and then we kind of went in different directions. I said that one of the big conflicts is that Molly doesn't want to go to school. And so she calls in sick for Molly, and her father is furious about that. And I do feel mixed about that. I think I would agree that like once or twice, maybe, yeah, that would be appropriate. But then it does become more what I would call a chronic thing to where, okay, let's address this. Let's get you going back to school.
Yes. Honestly, I felt about it the same way as I felt about their faking Homer's credentials in the Cider House rules. That it's like it's really, this isn't a good thing, and it's gonna blow up in your face. Of course, in the Cider House rules, I think the implication is that it never blew up in their face; they just got away with it. Whereas in this film, it does blow up in their face. Good for this film, because at the end of the day, there is a sense in which everything that we've said about grief, fine. We do have to not move on so much as in deflect from our grief and put it away, but we do have to move on in the sense that we have to confront the reality of our life.
Yeah, there's a reintegration.
We have to go to school. We have to go to work. And to me, like, my problem with what and why I would be furious too with what Corrina was doing at that moment was that I think she was trying to protect Molly from having to go back and live, which unfortunately you gotta do.
Yeah. And I think eventually she makes the folder for her and that kind of thing. And I think that's a great gesture and a great way to help. So,
Corrina's dealing with her own grief. And I think there's some there's a lot of transference in the film, but there's definitely transference there in the sense that, and I think part of the reason why Corrina doesn't or gives into her temptation to keep Molly out of school, as opposed to biting the bullet and making her go to school, is I think Corrina is acting out of her own grief. The fact that her husband left her. Well, did her husband die or did her husband? I think her husband died, actually.
I was trying to put all those pieces together, and I have to confess, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I think the film is somewhat ambivalent in whether or not Corrina makes the right call in keeping her out of school. I think you can just whether or not the film comes down one way or the other on whether it was the right call. I think you'd make a case either way, but I think that's Corrina acting out of her own pain. And it's really weird because in many ways Corrina does very, very well in being an informal chaplain for Molly. But in this way, I think she gives into transference and acts out of her own pain because she can't force herself, she can't bring herself to bite the bullet and do what has to be done.
Yeah. So let's talk about the sacramentality of pancakes at the drive-in.
Oh yeah. I've forgotten about that.
So one of the first things that Corrina does when she meets Molly and Molly is not talking at all, she takes her to this drive-in. I'm not sure exactly what you called it, but basically the waitress came out to the car and of course Molly's not talking, so she tells the waitress, get on in the car. It's gonna be a little bit as we look at the menu here. And then eventually, there's quite a bit of time where I love Corrina's like, these pancakes look so good. Let's try, she's trying to get her to order something and to communicate. And that's really what it's about, right? It's about getting her communicating again. And she says, I know you're not talking right now, so how about this? You just blink once, yes, twice, no, or something along those lines.
My wife is a much better parent than I am. And the reason why is because my wife does that, whereas I don't. I come from that male ego of something has to be done, so we're going to do it. And when Scarlett doesn't want to do it right, no, I'm going to make her do it right. Damn it. And it's like the way I would react to Molly not talking, I would hope that I would be sensitive enough to realize, well, she suffered great loss. So, if you need to not talk, you need to not talk. But let's assume that she was just not talking to not talk, right? Well, I would, no, you need to talk. You need to talk right now. You need to talk to me, young lady. You need to talk to me right. That's sort of how my mind processes.
And
She
do you
either
hear
talks or
how
she
you're
doesn't.
already escalating?
Yes, exactly. And so what my wife does is she no what my wife often does is takes Scarlett's, what I understand to be Scarlett falsely to be Scarlett's defiance, and sort of kind of turns it around, makes it into something useful. And that's sort of what Corrina does. It's like, okay, you don't want to talk, that's fine. We'll find a way to communicate that allows you your space to not talk.
Yeah.
And yeah, so and also, oh, you want to be angry? Well, let's go punch something. It's the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's those, again, that's why I am ambivalent on this movie, because there's some really good things, there's some things that I struggle with.
It did have Commander Data in it.
And I forget who he played.
I don't think he had a speaking role. Brent Spiner, who plays Commander Data in Star Trek: The Next Generation,
Right.
and both Pastor Michelle and I are huge Star Trek nuts. But he just had he was in the boardroom of the company when they were making the commercials. And I don't even think he had a speaking role. But this film has two great Star Trek actors, of course, Whoopi Goldberg, Guinan, and Lieutenant Commander Data, Brent Spiner.
So, what did you think about the character of the grandma? She plays a pretty significant part in all of this too. Because she has her own griefs that she experiences.
The film doesn't say much about her. Her accent, I think, suggests that she is, and this maybe my guessing, maybe some racism in my part. I, in my head canon, she is a Russian Jew, who, of course, experienced. Given the timeline, she probably would have gotten out of Europe before the Holocaust, but certainly would have experienced prejudice. Certainly would have experienced pogroms. And I think that her survival instinct is telling her that she has to keep her son safe, and part of keeping her son safe is preventing him from making the horrible mistake of dating a black woman. Because if her son does the terrible thing of dating a black woman, and by the way, that when I call it terrible, I'm being sarcastic. Please hear it that way. Then they'll never be accepted socially again. So on the one hand, she is the victim of that white supremacy, of that white Christian supremacy that sets up these false, stupid rules about what is socially acceptable and what is not. On the other hand, she's a survivor, and as a survivor, she recognizes she has to play by those rules, and she's trying to get her son to play by those rules too. Which, in spite of the fact that I have some problems with how the film depicts black culture, I do like how at the very last scene, Molly sits down with her and sings "This Little Light of Mine, I'm Gonna Let It Shine." The final thing I'll say about the grandma's character is that I would contrast him with the grandpa's character. My favorite character in the movie is Grandpa, because for two reasons. One, the grandpa is almost entirely silent throughout the entire film, and yet in his silence, he's probably one of the most helpful characters in terms of relating to Molly and relating to his son. There's one scene in which Molly tells Grandpa that wouldn't it be great if Daddy marries Corrina? And Grandpa smiles, and he didn't say anything. He just smiles and nods, and is
Yes.
like, "Yeah, that would be great." It's like he has no prejudice. He's like, "Yeah, that would be wonderful." It's clear that they really like each other, and if my son's happy, I'm happy.
Yeah.
And then there's another scene that's very beginning when Molly's hiding under the table, seeing all the shoes, and it's the grandpa who comes under the table with her and says nothing, but he just comes under the table and sits with her for
I'd
a
forgotten
while.
about that, but you're right.
Mm-hmm.
And then I want to talk about there's a beautiful, well, I don't know if I'll say beautiful, but an interesting arc and a parallel. I mentioned that we got the shoes at the beginning and the shoes towards the end when the grandpa dies.
Mm.
You're right that I loved that scene where Molly just sits down with her grandma who's lost her husband and just provides comfort in the way that she's learned to receive comfort.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting how there's a difference in the response of grief with Molly from the first, where she's kind of under the table, she's quiet, she's not responding really. And later on, we still see the view from the shoes, but then we get more after. We get that element of her sitting with her grandma in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's to me, part of this story is the story of learning from one grief that helps us with the next. And to be fair, each grief is different. Mm. Even an individual grieves each individual differently. Grieving a brother is different than an uncle or an aunt or a grandparent or they're just different. And each time we go through grief, we learn a little bit more. I think we find a little bit of self-compassion each time we grieve, that we understand, yeah, this is what grief feels like. And so we're not as afraid of it or put off by it.
I think that the grandma really, as a character, learns and changes in the course of the film. Mm-hmm. She goes from being a one who wants to go along to get along with social norms and social mores, to one who I think is, when in the last scene when Corrina and Ray Liotta's character are together. By the way, we referred to him as just Ray Liotta's characters. I don't think either of us remember his name. But,
yeah.
But when Corrina and Ray Liotta's character are together in the last scene, I think that the grandma is accepting. And I think that it's her grief with the loss of her husband that allows her to kind of move past the need for being socially appropriate, and able to live in a more authentic way. There's another thing, another change that I think parallels that, and that is Corrina's sister, who is very, very cautious about and angry at Corrina for getting too close to Ray Liotta's character because, well, she's the hired help. And from a Marxist perspective, she's absolutely right. The most horrid and exploitative companies in the world are those that try to tell their workers, you're part of the family. So there's a sense in which by treating Corrina as if she were a member of the family, that allows Ray Liotta's character to get more work out of her. To get her to be more productive, to get more hours out of her, and to not pay her overtime.
It blurs the boundaries.
Yes.
Of that relationship. Yeah.
Yes.
Which is the part of the problem with transference, is that a healthy relationship depends on healthy understandings of roles, identities, and boundaries.
Yes. And it's the use of that sense of that, it's the misuse, the twisting of that idea of familiality. That we're family, oh worker. Your company is your family, so you should go out of your way, put in unpaid overtime, put in like drive yourself half to death for your family, right? That's the propaganda of capitalism.
Makes me
Whereas,
think of the old horse on Animal Farm
yes,
who just says, I'm gonna just keep working. I'm just gonna keep working because I believe in this. I'm gonna keep.
which says, and if we can pull in Animal Farm and talk about that for a minute, which says something interesting, that Animal Farm is depicting a nominally socialist society, and of course Animal Farm, George Orwell was he might have denied this, but was very, very much so influenced by Leon Trotsky and his ideas about the Soviet Union and about communist states, nominally communist states, being state capitalist states. They're really just capitalism by another word. It's capitalism by another name, because it's the bourgeois class was replaced by the bureaucratic class of the state. And that's really what George Orwell talks about in 1984, and that's what George Orwell talks about in Animal Farm. And it is interesting how it parallels what a lot of capitalists do. And it was my experience in Walmart. Walmart tried to make us feel like we were part of the family, and they were the most exploitative bastards I ever worked for. Now that was a tangent, and I'm sorry about that.
But again, coming back to the movie, that is part of the concern. She is aware of the dangers and the dynamics and the reality.
And the sister names it that way. The sister names that concern. She puts a racial spin on it, which I think is absolutely correct. And you see that in The Help, to The Help's credit too. That part of the way in which white folks got hired African American help to be so loyal was by treating them like they were members of the family in one sense, in order to kind of get more work out of them.
Only to then throw them out when it was inconvenient for them. I mean, and that's the thing with The Help, is that we learn that the whole story with the white writer's maid was that she embarrassed the family during Daughters of the something something. And so yeah, there's that concern here as well that's being raised. I'm trying to think what else. I mean, I feel like we've covered
a lot. Well, while we're going on characters, I mean, what do we think of the wife's character, the deceased wife's character? Because she's a character in the film. She does have a role in the film.
I'm trying to make sense of it, because it is definitely, she is a ghost that leaves she very much leaves her thumbprints over everything, right? The fact that she had her side of the bed, and no one wants to sleep on that side of the bed.
There's something, and Reverend Michael Brown is a big Star Wars fan, so this is a shout out to him. But there's something that Luke Skywalker says in Star Wars: The Last Jedi that I love, and it's no one's ever really gone.
Yeah.
And it's this, to me, the role of the character of the deceased wife, whom I don't even think they ever give her a name.
No.
And I think they very intentionally do that. I think they don't discuss how she died. You could make a case that it was suicide. You could make a case that she got sick. You could make any number of cases, but they don't say how she died. They don't give her a name. I don't even do you even see a picture of her? I don't recall.
Well, now that you mention it, I don't know.
She is an off-screen presence par excellence, and I think that's actually one of the parts of the film that I really enjoy, because it demonstrates how, even though she's not there, she's there. And it demonstrates how no one's ever really gone. Every person we ever encounter it stays with us. In how they affect us and how we act in different ways, because they were in our lives. And to me, that's the point of the character of the deceased mother, that she demonstrates how, even if it is not the case that there is a heaven that she's smiling down from, it's still the case that Ray Liotta's character is wrong. She's not gone. She's very much so still present. She's there.
Agreed. And in fact, we would not have this story without her.
Mm-hmm.
So, which is kind of, so that reminds me of the movie, it's a similar kind of thing, Nanny McPhee.
I haven't seen it.
Yeah. So the scene starts with an empty chair. And it says, alas, if this chair were not empty, we would not have the story.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of that idea. But it's another great. Funnily enough, it's about a family that's lost a mother who's grieving, and in comes a nanny.
Of course.
So, well, and isn't it funny? Why is it that it's always portrayed that it's men who have lost a wife who have a hard time grieving? It just seems to me like there's a lot less often that we see a story of a woman who's lost a husband and struggles to grieve. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying it's a lot rarer that we see that portrayed.
Well, men are tough.
Mm-hmm.
Bullshit. We're not. But that's
the expectation,
right? And I think you can say that that's a feature of the film, not a bug. That it's because it's true that it is a social trope. But on the other hand, we live into social tropes whether we want to or not.
Right.
I try to be I believe that masculinity is bullshit, but I try to be masculine all the time because it's how I'm expected to be. And I think that Ray Liotta's character tries to move on and tries to be strong and that sort of thing. This is how society teaches him to be. He's a man, and he has to be a man. What do we think of Ray Liotta's character?
Again, I would say he.
By the way, his name is Manny.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, his name is Manny, the man.
Yeah. I was just thinking about how interesting it is. He's kind of a fascinating character because for a 1950s male, he is actually a pretty caring father.
Yes.
I think he tries to care. I think he doesn't know how to care, but I think he tries. And I find it really interesting. I find his job interesting.
Yes.
Because his job is a creative job.
He makes music for commercials.
Yeah, right. And
in the golden age of television, the 1950s.
Yeah, and so you would think that creativity could allow for outlet and expression and tapping into things in ways that maybe might not be as natural. But for some reason he struggles. And as I've said before, my main critique of him is that I don't think he knows how to listen.
I agree.
Molly, that they're kind of talking at cross purposes. He doesn't know how to say to her how he's feeling. She doesn't know how to say to him how she's feeling. They're both kind of just isolated in their grief. And that's the other thing about grief that we haven't talked about is grief, if we're not careful, can be isolating. And so the antidote to grief, when done well, is healthy community.
Yeah.
I think it's hard because, part of why I want to isolate from grief is I get tired of the bumper sticker bulk. The thing I'm like, if I have to hear you say that one more time.
There's so much unhealthy community out there.
Right. Exactly. Where and it's community that feels like I'm having to comfort you in your grief instead of you comforting me in what I'm going through.
There are very, very few people whom I would tell what I was thinking in the when someone I care about dies. There are very, very few people I talk to about it because I don't really trust everyone to really. A lot of people will give me those bumper sticker answers, which I just don't find particularly helpful.
Yeah.
There is interesting though you're mentioning of the father's of Manny's creativity and his job. One thing that I think the film really kind of misses is an opportunity to discuss the role of poetry in the relationship between. Well, let me back up. Music and poetry can be healing.
Yes.
music and poetry have a great ability to shape how we see the world, how we grieve, how we react with and interact with other people. But I think that the film, and it's very interesting that both Manny and Corrina are great music lovers and very artistic and very educated, and yet the place of music in the film is just really kind of as a MacGuffin that kind of brings them together. They don't really explore the ability to use music and poetry as a mechanism of healing.
Which I forgot, except for the fact that Molly, her mother, was trying to teach her a piece of music, and she's trying to complete the melody.
Yes.
And she can't quite do it until, and I forget what the melody was, but I knew it was
Good
something
King Wenceslas.
Yeah, that's right.
Good King Wenceslas looked out on the feast of Stephen.
Yeah. And so Corrina comes over and helps her finish it.
They could have done more with it, though. Not so much.
I agree.
Wenceslas itself, but the fact that they connect over their love of music, and yet that's all it is. That's all that's really the only role that music plays in the film, is just that it brings it acts as fuel for the romantic relationships in Corrina and Manny. Beyond that, there's not a lot of depth to it. Although they're both, I think, suggested to be aficionados of good music, even though he works by making jingles.
Yeah. Well, and I did think of something else as I was watching the movie, and it's jumping back to the character of Corrina. She is a lot more smart than I think people realize. There's pieces of her that, like, she's actually had some pretty good education.
Well, the film says that outright. I mean, she graduated from college, but and
I don't mean to say that with a tone of surprise, like she shouldn't be, but I think it's the surprise because she kind of, it's there, but she doesn't really make a big hoopla of it.
Both Corrina and Manny are educated people and appreciate the arts, and I think the film says that quite well. I'm curious what you think about this. There's a line in the film about Corrina and Manny are talking, and Manny objects to the idea of using theology as a means to comfort his daughter, because it strikes him as a lie, right? It strikes him telling her that your mother's in heaven, which is just dead, is a lie. Now, first off, I, for the record, do believe in heaven, and I do believe in an afterlife and all of that, but there's a sense in which I can appreciate where he's coming from there, because if I didn't believe in heaven, well, I would probably still believe that the key to salvation is confronting the truth. And yet, Corrina says something interesting. One of her lines is, "What's wrong with making something up to help people feel better?" And I'm like, I have mixed feelings about that statement right there.
Yeah. That is really interesting, because I am a fundamental believer in being very honest with children. I think part of the challenge is, part of Molly's difficulty and grief is that her father is basically kind of said, he made up this untruth about, she just went and got
in the bathtub.
And right. And so that was not helpful. And so I think I fundamentally believe in being honest. I think it depends, like, if someone comes to this conclusion on their own where they say this, I don't necessarily think I would entirely disabuse them of a notion that they've come up with. What I was trying to think about, though, is did Corrina say she's in heaven, or did she say, I believe she's in heaven?
I don't recall.
Yeah, because I think there would be a distinction there. I think there's a distinction to say, if she is simply telling Molly that out of her own need to tell that and press her beliefs, that's one thing. But if Molly asks and she says, well, here's what I believe, and kind of you can believe it or not.
But it's an invitation to reframe the matter. It's an invitation. Like, maybe this will be comforting for you. I mean,
yeah, right, exactly. And so I think that's where the distinction for me would be.
I'm torn on the statement, because on the one hand, there is a great honesty in the statement that, yeah, it may very well be the case that there is no such thing as heaven, but, well, if it helps me to be okay in my grief, believing in heaven, what the fuck's wrong with that? There's a great honesty in putting it that way, and to her credit, Corrina is, quite honest in her presentation of it that way to Mandy, that she's like, yeah, I honestly, whether or not there's a heaven, I don't know, but it helps her and it helps me. So as long as we know what we're doing, as long as we honestly understand that we might be engaging in a little bit of harmless wishful thinking. I guess I can roll with that. But on the other hand, part of me believes, and maybe I'm expecting a little too much of a child here, of an 8-year-old child like Molly. Part of you have to confront the reality of life, of death as finitude. Even if you believe in an afterlife, you have to confront the reality that God is God and you are not. And that means, as God is eternal and we wither and fade with the grass. And there's a good news in that, in the sense that it makes this life right now truly worth living, truly worth pouring yourself into, sucking the marrow out of life. To quote from Thoreau, the idea of death as finitude, even if there is an afterlife, is good news, because that means that, as the Bible says, this is the day the Lord has made. Rejoice and be glad in it.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a really interesting question, and I think it comes down to intent. And what's interesting to me, you just talked about that. I think about talking about beliefs about Santa Claus. And is it a lie to tell our kids that Santa Claus exists? Well, no, because there's actually a Bishop of Mira, but
okay, so a little bit of personal family self-disclosure. Scarlett asked me a few days ago if the Tooth Fairy was real. And I believe, and this comes to me from our mutual CPE supervisor, pastoral education supervisor, Roy, who says that when someone asks the question, they're ready to hear the answer. And so I told her that the Tooth Fairy is a myth. And I then tried to define, and my daughter's 7 years old, so I might have been a little. I try to say, no, it's not a lie; it's a myth. There's a difference between a lie and a myth, right? And we had what I would consider to be a very, very fraught, very, very tearful. She was crying when I told her this, and it was really interesting. We showed her that her old teeth that we'd kept, right? Because of course we told her that the Tooth Fairy took them away and gave her money, and she asked me right out, "Is it just you giving me the money?" Yeah, I said that it's just us. However, what does this mean exactly? It's you telling someone a story that puts magic in their lives, right? It's you giving something to someone else. It's you becoming the Tooth Fairy, right? You get to be someone else's Tooth Fairy. That's the story. And that's why the story of the Tooth Fairy is true, Scarlett, because you get to go out and do it. You get to go out and be someone's Tooth Fairy. And that's really cool if you think about it. It means that the story of the Tooth Fairy isn't false. It's true. It's not historical, but it's true. And course, how I handle Santa Claus is that, and I fully believe what I'm about to say 100%, in even a very literal way, is that the spirit of St. Nicholas of Myra, blessed be his name, inspires us to give gifts to each other.
Yeah.
Santa Claus gives gifts. Bingo. There is a real Santa Claus. He was a gift-giving bishop from Myra in Turkey, and he really gave gifts to children, and he really inspires us to give gifts to children. So therefore, the Santa Claus story is 100% true.
Yep. So, but isn't it interesting? So it seems to be around that 7 or 8 that kids ask those questions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so of course Molly is about that age, and she's trying to make sense of this truth, and to realize, you know, the magic she knew is different. The safe world that she knew is now changed because she's lost someone that she thought she would be able to depend on for her whole life, and up to this point she has depended on.
Yeah.
So
if you were preaching a sermon on this, Pastor, what would the takeaway be for the congregation?
Ooh, yeah. I think I would talk about the grief element for sure. I would talk about the healing element of relationships, that if you have good, healthy relationships, that is the most beautiful therapy in the world. You know, we all need those friends without an agenda, without a baggage that they're bringing to you.
Mm-hmm.
Which isn't to say we don't bring baggage. It's just, I'm not dumping my baggage on you. Let me say it that way.
To Corrina, I mean, there's no relationship without baggage. And it's okay to want something from someone else, right? I mean, I want something in my relationships with people, but what to Corrina's credit, she's open about it. I want the job. That's what I need the job. Yeah. She says right out, this is what I want from you. And when you're open and honest about what you want from someone, and give them the freedom to say, no, I'm not giving it to you, and say, all right, that's fine. Then you can have a deeper relationship beyond what you want out of another person.
Yeah. So that's what I would probably talk about. How about you?
Oh, I don't know. I'd probably talk about the same thing you talked about. I think I was thinking it as you said it. Yeah, you kind of took my sermon away, but that's okay. That's okay. We can do the same sermon. There's nothing that says we can't, because as long as the congregation has a good takeaway, right?
Right. So what is our next movie?
Our next movie is Days of Thunder. Which is so we're one of our clinical pastoral education colleagues picked this film for us. Is a fellow by the name of Dave Hickey. It's our audience pick. Dave Hickey is a very good friend of mine. He was gone before you came along to the CPE Center, but he and I developed a kind of a bro friendship. He and I kind of bonded over military movies, and he's a Republican, but he's a great guy.
And he's a great guy.
And thank you. Sorry, Dave. And he's a wonderful, wonderful guy, and a wonderful brother in Christ, and just a very compassionate chaplain, and all that. But one of his favorite films is Days of Thunder. And when he told me that, and because we bonded over movies, like, Days of Thunder, it's just Top Gun on a racetrack. No, Andrew, watch it. Trust me, watch it from a theological perspective. Trust me. And so I watched it from a theological perspective, and I was blown away. Michelle, I think you'll like it because it's process theology all over it. It is a process theology movie. Like, and I swear it is full of process theology, especially in the relationship between Tom Cruise's character, the race car driver, who kind of takes on the human character, and then Robert Duvall's character, who takes on the God character, and both of them having to relate to each other and learn and grow with each other. Although the one is clearly more powerful and more mature, and far smarter than the other, but even the one who's smarter has to grow and mature, and it's a beautiful theological film, even though it's Top Gun on a racetrack, and it's and there are a lot of Confederate flags. Ugh. Anyway,
boo.
Yeah, fuck the Confederacy.
So, Well, we are so thankful to all of you who have stuck with us and joined in our conversation today as we've talked about the movie Corrina. We hope that you will take a little of that movie magic home with you and continue watching movies in your own life. We are so grateful for those who have made this happen for us today, for editor Wesley, who makes us sound way more intelligent.
And we give him a
And
lot of work.
And we thank our music creator, Gail Gallagher, who is also a production partner with us. And most of all, we're thankful for you, the listener, for the ways that you share and comment and review and just get the word out there. We have a few ways for you to support us through our Patreon, where you can become a patron at different levels and receive access to our monthly roundtable discussion comedy. Blessed Lunatics as well. So we are thankful for you joining us today, and we hope that you'll join us again on the next time a pastor and a priest walk into a movie theater.